Listen closely. There are moments in history when the world pauses not because it planned to, but because something so rare, so unexpected, so divinely timed happens that even doubt goes silent. This is that moment. You stand here today carrying something that others didn't even dare to touch, not because they lacked talent, not because they lacked opportunity, but because somewhere along the way, they stopped believing it was possible. But you didn't. You walked into a path that had no footprints, no map, no applause waiting at the finish line. Only uncertainty and the quiet whisper inside you that refused to die. That whisper was not random. It was a calling. And understand, this being chosen doesn't feel like glory in the beginning. It feels like isolation. It feels like confusion. It feels like questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself. Why me? Why this burden? Why this road with no guarantee? Because history has always required one person to go first, not the most perfect, not the most prepared, but the one willing to move when no one else would. You didn't wait for permission. You didn't wait for validation. You didn't wait for the world to understand. You moved. And in that movement, you broke something invisible, a barrier that existed only because no one had challenged it before. Do you realize what that means? You didn't just achieve something. You created possibility. There are people watching your story right now, people who will never meet you, never speak your name, yet their lives will change because you proved it could be done. That is what it means to be the first in history. It is not about ego. It is about responsibility. Because now, you are evidence. Evidence that fear can be faced. Evidence that limits can be rewritten. Evidence that the impossible was never truly impossible, it was just waiting for someone brave enough to confront it. And here is the truth most won't tell you. The moment you succeed is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a new calling. Because now, the same world that doubted you will look to you for direction. They will ask, how did you do it? But what they really mean is, can I do it too? And your life will become the answer. So stand tall, not because you are above others, but because you have walked through something others feared. Stay humble, not because you are small, but because you understand the weight of what you carry. And keep moving, not because the journey is easy, but because stopping is no longer an option. You were not chosen to fit in. You were chosen to shift something, to awaken something, to prove something. So when doubt tries to revisit you, and it will, remember this moment. Remember that there was a time when no one even tried. And then there was you. You didn't just step forward. You stepped into history. And history will never be the same again. Before anyone ever called your name, before any recognition, before any visible sign that your life would be different, something quiet began to stir within you. It did not arrive with noise or celebration. It did not come with certainty or clarity. It came like a whisper, subtle, persistent, almost easy to ignore. Yet somehow, you couldn't ignore it. While others were moving with the rhythm of what was expected, you felt a tension, a pull in a direction that didn't quite make sense at the time. You tried to explain it, even to yourself. Maybe it was ambition. Maybe it was restlessness. Maybe it was just curiosity stretching beyond its limits. But deep down, you knew it was something else. It was not loud enough to convince anyone else, but it was strong enough that you couldn't silence it. It followed you into quiet moments. It lingered in your thoughts when everything else faded. It asked questions no one around you seemed to be asking. Why not you? Why not now? Why does this path feel like it's waiting for you when no one else is even looking in its direction? There was no immediate answer. Only the growing awareness that you were standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. And that awareness came with discomfort, because when you are the only one who senses something others don't, it creates distance. Not always visible, not always spoken, but deeply felt. You could be surrounded by people and still feel like you were carrying something alone. You noticed it in conversations. The things that excited others didn't quite ignite the same fire in you. The paths that seemed obvious to everyone else felt incomplete to you. It wasn't that you rejected them completely, it was that something inside you kept saying, there is more than this. And that more didn't come with instructions. So you stayed quiet about it. Because how do you explain a calling that hasn't fully revealed itself? How do you describe a direction when you don't yet have the map? You learned early that not every feeling is meant to be shared immediately. Some things have to grow in silence before they can survive in the open. But silence does not mean absence. That whisper kept returning. In moments of stillness, in moments of frustration, even in moments when you tried to distract yourself from it. It didn't demand your attention aggressively, it waited for it patiently. And over time, it became impossible to deny that it was shaping the way you saw everything. You began to notice what others overlooked. You began to question what others accepted. Not out of rebellion, but out of an inner knowing that something was incomplete. And that knowing didn't make life easier, it made it more complex. Because once you see differently, you cannot unsee. There were moments when you wished you could just blend in, follow the familiar route, and quiet the voice that kept pushing you towards something uncertain. It would have been easier to accept what was already established, easier to agree with what was already proven, easier to stay within the boundaries that had already been drawn. But something within you resisted that ease, not because you were trying to be different, but because you were unable to be anything else. And that is the part most people misunderstand about being chosen. It doesn't feel like privilege in the beginning. It feels like being set apart without explanation. It feels like carrying a question that has not yet found its answer. It feels like standing at the edge of a possibility that no one else acknowledges. You started to realize that this wasn't something you had created. You didn't wake up one day and decide to feel this way. It was already there, waiting for you to notice it, waiting for you to recognize that it wasn't leaving. And with that realization came a quiet shift. You stopped trying to completely silence it. You began, slowly, cautiously, to listen. Not with full confidence, not with complete understanding, but with enough openness to acknowledge that this whisper might be guiding you somewhere, even if you didn't yet know where that was. Listening didn't immediately remove the fear. If anything, it made the stakes feel higher. Because now you were aware that ignoring it would mean turning away from something important, and following it would mean stepping into something unknown. There was no applause waiting for that decision, no guarantee that it would lead to success, no visible proof that it would make sense in the end. Only the quiet certainty that staying where you were would feel like a slow form of settling, and you were not built for settling. So you began to shift, internally first. Your thoughts started to change direction. Your attention started to move toward things that aligned with that inner pull. You became more aware of moments that resonated, even if you couldn't fully explain why. Small signals started to stand out. Patterns began to form, not clearly, but enough to suggest that something was unfolding. You didn't call it purpose yet. You didn't call it destiny. You simply recognized that something was guiding you, and that guidance felt too consistent to be random. At times, it felt like you were learning to trust something you couldn't fully see, like walking in a dimly lit space where each step only revealed the next one, but never the entire path. That kind of movement requires a different kind of strength. Not the strength of certainty, but the strength of willingness. Willingness to move without full understanding. Willingness to feel discomfort without immediate relief. Willingness to continue even when no one else recognizes what you're responding to. And that willingness began to shape you, quietly, gradually, without announcement. You became more attuned to that inner voice, even when external voices tried to override it. Not because those external voices were always wrong, but because they were not aligned with what you were carrying. And alignment matters more than approval when you are walking a path that hasn't been validated yet. There were still moments of doubt. Moments where you questioned whether you were imagining it, whether you were reading too much into something that didn't exist. But even in those moments, the whisper did not disappear. It remained steady and patient, not forcing you, but not leaving you either. And that persistence began to reveal something important. This was not a temporary feeling. This was not a passing phase. This was the beginning of something that would continue to unfold, whether you fully understood it or not. Something had chosen you before you chose it, and that realization carried a weight that could not be ignored. There came a point when the whisper was no longer something you could quietly observe from a distance. It had grown stronger, not louder in volume, but deeper in presence. It no longer asked for your attention, it required your response. And that response demanded movement. Not safe movement, not predictable movement, but a step into a direction that had no visible confirmation. You stood at the edge of that decision longer than anyone realized. From the outside, it may have looked like hesitation, like uncertainty, like delay. But internally, it was something far more complex. You were weighing the cost of stepping into the unknown against the cost of staying where you were. And the truth was, both carried a kind of fear. Staying meant comfort, familiarity, and acceptance. It meant walking along a path that had already been walked, where outcomes were somewhat predictable and risks were somewhat controlled. It meant being understood without having to explain yourself too much. There is a certain safety in that kind of life, a rhythm that doesn't challenge your identity too aggressively. But there was also a quiet emptiness in it, because every time you imagined yourself fully committing to that path, something inside you resisted. Not dramatically, not in a way that others could easily see, but enough that you felt it. A subtle but persistent discomfort, like wearing something that fits, but never quite feels like it belongs to you. And then there was the other option, the path with no footprints, the direction that no one around you seemed to be taking, the idea that didn't come with a guidebook, a guarantee, or even a clear explanation. It didn't offer comfort. It didn't offer immediate validation. It didn't promise that others would understand, support, or even acknowledge what you were trying to do. It only offered possibility. And possibility can be intimidating when it comes without structure. Because stepping into possibility means accepting that you will not have all the answers. It means you will make decisions without full certainty. It means you will move forward without knowing exactly how things will unfold. And for most people, that level of uncertainty is enough to stop them before they even begin. But you reached a point where not beginning felt heavier than failing. That was the shift. Not confidence, not clarity, but a realization that staying still was no longer an option you could live with. The whisper had become too clear, too consistent, too deeply rooted in your awareness. Ignoring it now would not bring peace, it would create a different kind of struggle. One that would follow you into every version of the life you tried to settle for. So you made a decision. Not a loud one, not one that required an announcement, but a quiet, internal commitment to move in the direction that had been calling you, even if you didn't fully understand it. And that first step was not dramatic. It didn't feel like a breakthrough moment. It felt small, almost insignificant from the outside. A choice, an action, a shift in focus that no one else would necessarily recognize as the beginning of something different. But internally, it was everything. Because it marked the moment you stopped resisting and started responding. That is where the real journey began. Not when things became clear, but when you chose to move without clarity. And as you took that step, something changed, not in the world around you immediately, but within you. There was a new awareness, a heightened sensitivity to everything connected to that path. You began to notice opportunities that you might have ignored before. You began to see connections where others saw randomness. It was as if your decision had tuned your perspective to a different frequency. But with that shift came resistance. Not always from others, though that would come later. The first resistance came from within. Old patterns of thinking, old fears, old doubts. They didn't disappear just because you made a decision. If anything, they became more active, more vocal, more insistent. What are you doing? This doesn't make sense. You don't even know where this is going. Those thoughts didn't come as enemies. They came as protectors, trying to pull you back into what was familiar. Because the mind is designed to keep you safe, and safety often looks like repetition, predictability, and control. But growth rarely aligns with those things. So you found yourself in a constant negotiation between the part of you that wanted to move forward and the part of you that wanted to retreat. Some days, the forward movement felt natural, almost effortless. Other days, it felt like you were forcing yourself through invisible resistance, questioning every step along the way. And yet, you kept moving. Not perfectly, not without hesitation, but consistently enough that the distance between where you started and where you were began to grow. And with that distance came a new realization. There were no footprints behind you, no clear trail to confirm that others had done this before, no established markers to tell you that you were on the right path. Just your own movement, your own decisions, your own willingness to continue. At first, that realization felt isolating, because without footprints, there is no comparison. Without comparison, there is no easy way to measure progress. You cannot look at someone ahead of you and say, I am on track. You cannot look behind you and say, I am following correctly. You are simply moving. And that kind of movement requires a deeper level of trust. Not in external validation, but in your own alignment. You begin to rely less on what others think and more on what you feel to be true. Not emotionally in a reactive way, but intuitively in a grounded way. You start to understand that the absence of footprints is not a sign that you are lost. It is a sign that you are leading. Even if you don't fully feel like a leader yet. Even if you still question yourself. Even if you still wonder whether this path will make sense in the long run. Because leading is not always about confidence. Sometimes it is simply about continuing when no one else has gone this way before. And as you continued, something else became clear. The path was not entirely empty. It was unmarked, yes, but not without meaning. Every step you took began to create its own imprint. Every decision you made added to a pattern that did not exist before. You were not just walking the path, you were forming it. And that formation required patience, because unlike a path that already exists, this one did not immediately become smooth or easy to navigate. There were obstacles, uncertainties, moments where you questioned whether you had taken a wrong turn. But even those moments contributed to the path itself. They shaped your understanding, refined your awareness, and strengthened your ability to move forward without needing constant reassurance. You began to see that this journey was not just about reaching a destination. It was about becoming someone capable of walking where others hesitate. Someone who does not rely entirely on external structure to move. Someone who can stand in uncertainty without collapsing into fear. And that kind of becoming does not happen all at once. It unfolds with every step taken despite doubt. With every moment you choose to continue instead of retreat. With every decision to trust that the whisper that led you here was not guiding you into emptiness, but into something that had yet to be revealed. As you continued forward, something began to surface that was far more difficult than the unknown path itself. It wasn't the absence of direction that tested you the most. It was the presence of an internal battle that refused to stay quiet. The further you walked into unfamiliar territory, the louder certain parts of you become not to guide you, but to challenge you. This was not a battle you could see. No one around you could fully understand it. From the outside, it may have looked like progress, like movement, like quiet determination. But internally, it felt like standing in the middle of opposing forces, each pulling you in a different direction, each demanding to be heard. One voice reminded you why you started. It spoke with calm conviction, even if it didn't always provide detailed answers. It didn't argue aggressively. It didn't panic. It simply returned, again and again, with a steady reminder that there was a reason you stepped onto this path, even if you couldn't fully articulate it. The other voice was far more intense. It questioned everything. It dissected every decision you made. It pointed out every flaw, every uncertainty, every possible outcome that could go wrong. It replayed moments where you felt unsure, amplifying them until they felt like proof that you didn't belong where you were heading. What if you're wrong? What if this doesn't work? What if you've misunderstood everything? Those questions didn't come once. They came repeatedly, sometimes subtly, sometimes with overwhelming force. And they didn't wait for convenient moments. They appeared when you were already tired, already uncertain, already stretched thin from the effort of continuing. That is what made this battle different. It wasn't just about logic or reasoning. It was emotional. It was psychological. It was deeply personal. Because the voice of doubt doesn't speak as a stranger. It speaks in your own tone, using your own language, drawing from your own experiences. It feels familiar, which makes it harder to dismiss. It feels like it might be telling the truth, which makes it harder to ignore. And in those moments, the path ahead seemed less intimidating than the thoughts within. You began to realize that the journey you were on was not just external. It wasn't only about what you were building, creating, or pursuing. It was about confronting parts of yourself that had never been challenged at this level before. Old fears resurfaced. Not always the obvious ones, but the ones that had been quietly shaping your decisions for years. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of being misunderstood, fear of investing everything into something that might not return what you hoped for. These fears had always existed in some form. But now, they were being activated in a new way. Because you were no longer operating within familiar boundaries, you were stepping beyond them. And anything beyond the familiar triggers a response. The mind tries to protect you by bringing up every possible risk, every potential weakness, every reason to reconsider. At times, it felt overwhelming. There were moments when the weight of those internal conversations made it difficult to take even a single step forward. Not because the path had physically changed, but because your perception of it had been clouded by doubt. And doubt has a way of distorting reality. It can make small obstacles feel insurmountable. It can make progress feel insignificant. It can make you question things that once felt clear. You started to notice how easily your energy could shift, depending on which voice you listened to. When you aligned with the quieter, steadier voice, even uncertainty felt manageable. There was a sense of direction, even if it wasn't fully defined. But when the louder voice took over, everything felt unstable, uncertain, and fragile. This back and forth became part of your daily experience. Some days felt like alignment. Other days felt like resistance. And there were days when you couldn't tell the difference. But despite all of it, something within you refused to let go completely. Even in moments where doubt felt convincing, even in moments where stepping back seemed like the logical choice, there was still a part of you that held on. Not aggressively, not with overwhelming confidence, but quietly, persistently. That quiet persistence became your anchor. You began to understand that strength was not about eliminating doubt. It was about continuing in its presence, because waiting for complete certainty would mean never moving at all. You also started to see that this internal battle was not a sign that you were on the wrong path. If anything, it was a sign that you were stretching beyond your previous limits. Growth creates tension. Expansion creates resistance. And when you challenge what has always felt safe, something within you will react. Not to stop you completely, but to test you. To see whether your decision was temporary or committed. To see whether you would turn back at the first sign of discomfort or continue despite it. And those tests did not come in a single moment. They came repeatedly. In different forms, through different thoughts, through different situations that triggered the same underlying fears. Each time you were faced with a choice, not always a dramatic one. Sometimes it was as simple as deciding whether to keep going for one more step or to pause indefinitely. Sometimes it was choosing whether to believe the voice that told you to stop or the one that told you to continue. Those choices, though small in the moment, began to define your direction. You were not just walking a path, you were shaping your relationship with yourself, learning which voice to trust, learning how to respond to doubt without being consumed by it, learning how to hold uncertainty without letting it paralyze you. And that learning process was not immediate. It required repetition. It required patience. It required facing the same internal challenges more than once, each time with slightly more awareness, slightly more control, slightly more resilience. You began to recognize patterns. Certain thoughts would appear at predictable moments when you were about to take a bigger step, when you were about to commit more deeply, when you were about to move beyond a certain threshold. The intensity of doubt often increased right before moments of progress. At first, that felt discouraging. It made you question whether progress was even worth it if it came with this level of internal resistance. But over time, you started to see it differently. The resistance was not random. It was connected to growth. The closer you moved towards something meaningful, the stronger the internal pushback became. Not because you were failing, but because you were approaching something that required a higher version of yourself. And becoming that version meant facing what you would rather avoid. Facing the thoughts that told you weren't ready. Facing the fears that told you weren't capable. Facing the uncertainty that told you there was no guarantee. And choosing to continue anyway. That choice did not eliminate the battle, but it changed your position within it. You were no longer just reacting. You were responding. Not perfectly, not consistently, but intentionally enough that the balance began to shift. The quieter voice grew stronger. Not in volume, but in influence, and the louder voice, though still present, began to lose its authority. Not because it disappeared, but because you stopped treating it as the final truth. You started to see it for what it was, a part of you, not the whole of you. A reaction, not a command. A possibility, not a certainty. And that distinction changed everything about how you moved forward. There are moments that do not announce themselves as significant while you are living through them. They do not arrive with dramatic music or visible signs that something irreversible is about to happen. Instead, they appear disguised as ordinary decisions, quiet actions, or small shifts that seem almost insignificant at the time. Yet, hidden within those moments is the exact point where everything begins to change. You did not wake up one day and suddenly feel like you had reached something historic. There was no clear signal that said, "This is it. This is the moment that separates before from after." What you felt instead was pressure. A kind of internal and external pressure that had been building gradually, almost unnoticed, until it reached a level that could no longer be ignored. It came from everything you had been carrying, every step you had taken without certainty, every internal battle you had fought in silence, every moment you had chosen to continue when stopping would have been easier. All of it accumulated into a point where something had to give, and that point did not feel comfortable. It felt intense. It felt like standing at the edge of a decision that could not be undone, even though no one around you might fully understand its weight. Because from the outside, it might have looked like just another action, just another attempt, just another step along the way. But internally, you knew it was different. There was a clarity that didn't come from having all the answers, but from recognizing that everything you had been moving toward was converging into this moment. Not in a perfectly structured way, not in a way that made logical sense at every level, but in a way that felt undeniable. You could feel it in how focused you became. Distractions lost their grip. External opinions became quieter, not because they disappeared, but because they no longer held the same authority over your decisions. There was a narrowing of attention, a sharpening of intent, a deep sense that what you were about to do mattered in a way that went beyond immediate results. And still, there was no guarantee. That is what made the moment so real. You were not stepping forward because success was certain. You were stepping forward because not doing so was no longer an option you could accept. That distinction changed everything about how you approached it. Fear was still present. Doubt had not completely vanished, but they no longer had the final say. They were there, but they were no longer in control. And so you moved, not perfectly, not without hesitation, but with enough commitment that the action itself became undeniable. The moment you acted, something shifted not just externally, but internally in a way that could not be reversed. Because action has a way of solidifying what thought can only circle around. Once you move, you cross a threshold that thinking alone can never reach. And in that movement, something invisible broke. A limit that had existed not because it was impossible, but because it had never been fully challenged in the way you challenged it. Others may have approached it, considered it, even believed in it at some level, but they did not take that final step. You did. And that difference, though it may have looked small from the outside, carried immense weight. Because the first time something is done, it transforms from an idea into reality. It moves from possibility into proof. And proof has a different kind of power. Before, it was something that could be questioned. Now, it was something that could be seen. Before, it required belief without evidence. Now, it required acknowledgement. That shift does not always create immediate noise. In fact, it often begins quietly. There is a brief moment where even you might not fully grasp what has just happened. Because when you are inside the process, you are focused on the doing, not on the significance of what is being done. But then awareness begins to catch up. You start to recognize that something you once thought of as distant, uncertain, or even unreachable has now become something you have actually touched, something you have done. And that realization carries a unique kind of impact. Not loud, not explosive, but deeply grounding, because it changes how you see yourself. It alters the way you interpret your own limits. It shifts your understanding of what is possible, not in theory, but through direct experience. And that shift cannot be undone. Once you know something is possible because you have done it, you cannot return to the same level of doubt that existed before. You may still question other things, you may still face new uncertainties, but that specific barrier no longer holds the same power. You have crossed it, and crossing it creates a ripple, not just within you but beyond you. Because even if the world does not immediately recognize it, the fact that it has been done changes the landscape. It creates a reference point that did not exist before. It establishes a new standard, even if it takes time for others to see it. And while that external recognition may come later, the internal shift happens immediately. You begin to understand that what once felt like an impossible distance was, in reality, a series of steps that required persistence, resilience, and a willingness to continue beyond comfort. You also begin to see that the moment itself was not isolated. It was the result of everything that came before it, every quiet decision, every internal battle, every step taken without full clarity. All of it led here. And that realization deepens your understanding of the process. It was never about a single action. It was about the accumulation of choices that made that action possible. And with that understanding comes a different kind of awareness. Because now you know that what feels impossible in one moment can become inevitable through consistent movement over time. Not guaranteed, not effortless, but achievable in a way that is grounded in reality rather than assumption. And that knowledge changes how you approach everything that comes next. Because you are no longer operating from the same level of uncertainty that existed before. You have evidence. Not borrowed, not observed, but lived. And that evidence carries a weight that cannot be easily dismissed. It stays with you. In how you think, in how you decide, in how you respond to new challenges that once might have felt overwhelming. Because now, somewhere within you, there is a reference point that says, you have already done something that once felt out of reach. And that reference point becomes part of how you move forward. What follows after a breakthrough is rarely what people expect. From a distance, it looks like arrival. It looks like completion, like a moment where everything settles into place and the struggle finally gives way to ease. But standing inside it, you begin to realize that what you've stepped into is not an ending. It is a transition into something that carries a different kind of weight. Because now, it's no longer just about what you believed was possible. It's about what you've proven. And proof changes the nature of responsibility. Before, you were allowed to question. Before, you were allowed to hesitate. Before, you were allowed to exist in the space of uncertainty without it affecting anything beyond your own internal world. But now, your actions have extended beyond you. Even if you didn't intend for it to happen, even if you never sought attention or recognition, the reality remains that what you've done exists as an example. And examples have influence, whether they are acknowledged openly or not. There are people who will see what you've done and begin to reconsider what they once believed was impossible. There are people who will measure their own hesitation against your action and feel something shift within them. There are people who will never speak your name, never directly connect their change to your decision, yet will move differently because you moved first. That is the part no one prepares you for, the unseen impact, because influence is not always visible. It does not always arrive in the form of applause, recognition, or validation. In many cases, it happens quietly, in places you will never witness, in lives you will never directly touch. And yet, it is happening. That awareness brings a different kind of pressure. Not the pressure to perform, but the pressure to remain aligned with what you've demonstrated. Because once you become evidence, inconsistency carries more weight. Not because you are expected to be perfect, but because your actions now represent something larger than a single moment. You are no longer just someone who attempted. You are someone who succeeded in doing what had not been done. And that distinction changes how you see yourself. It also changes how others, whether they express it or not, begin to see you. There is a shift in perception. Some will feel inspired. Some will feel challenged. Some may even feel uncomfortable, not because of anything you've done wrong, but because your existence disrupts the limits they have accepted for themselves. And navigating those responses requires awareness, because not all reactions will feel supportive. Not all responses will be encouraging. There will be moments where the weight of expectation, real or perceived, begins to surface. Moments where you feel the need to maintain what you've achieved, to prove that it was not a coincidence, to show that it can be sustained. And that is where the burden begins to take shape, not as something negative, but as something real. Because carrying proof means carrying the awareness that what you do next matters in a different way. Before, failure would have been part of the process, something you could learn from without it affecting a broader narrative. Now, every step forward or backward can feel amplified, as if it represents more than just your personal journey. That feeling can be heavy if you allow it to define you. But it can also become a source of grounding if you understand it correctly, because the responsibility is not to become flawless. The responsibility is to remain authentic, to continue moving in alignment with what brought you here in the first place. Not the recognition, not the outcome, but the willingness to step into the unknown and act despite uncertainty. That is what created the shift, and that is what must continue. You begin to realize that being first does not mean being finished. In many ways, it means being at the beginning of something that will continue to evolve. Others will follow. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually. Some will take the path you opened and build upon it. Some will approach it differently and expand it in ways you did not anticipate. And that is how progress works. It does not stop with the first. It begins there. An understanding that removes a certain kind of pressure. Because you are not required to carry everything alone. You are part of a larger unfolding, even if it started with your decision. Still, there is a personal weight that remains. The awareness that you have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. You cannot return to the version of yourself that had not yet done this. You cannot unknow what you now know about your own capacity. You cannot fully shrink back into limitations that you have already broken through. And that awareness changes how you approach everything moving forward. It raises your standard, not because of external expectation, but because of internal understanding. You know what it took to get here. You know the level of focus, persistence, and resilience that was required. And you know that continuing at this level is not automatic. It requires intention. It requires discipline. It requires a continued willingness to face discomfort rather than avoid it. There will be moments where you feel the pull to rest in what you have already achieved. Moments where it seems reasonable to pause indefinitely, to hold on to the success without pushing further. And rest, in itself, is not the problem. The question is whether rest becomes stagnation, because the same voice that once called you forward has not disappeared. It may have changed in tone. It may now ask different questions, but it is still there, reminding you that this is not the final form of what you are meant to become. And listening to that voice again requires the same openness that you had at the beginning, the same willingness to step forward without having every detail defined, The same courage to move beyond what is comfortable, even when comfort is now more accessible than it was before. That is the paradox of reaching this point. It becomes easier to stay still, but staying still no longer feels the same, because you have experienced what it means to move beyond limits, and that experience reshapes your relationship with comfort. You begin to see that growth is not something you visit once. It is something you continue to engage with, and being first is not a title to hold. It is a position that requires ongoing awareness. Awareness of why you started, awareness of how you moved, awareness of what you are now capable of becoming beyond this point. And that awareness stays with you, shaping your decisions, your mindset, and your direction in ways that cannot be undone.